Hello, everyone. Welcome to Tasty Kitchen. I am so excited for today's video because we have a special guest in the house. We are going to be chatting with Ashley Anderson, who is the owner of the Brown Paper Baking Company. She is a sourdough expert, and she's going to be walking us through making sourdough. And I wanted to invite her because I know this year everyone has been in their kitchen making sourdough. I've been offered sourdough starters by pretty much everyone I know. Do you want a sourdough starter? I'm like, okay, I don't know anything about sourdough, and I know a lot of you guys have had questions around how to make your sourdough, how to care for your starter, how to get really good results with your sourdough. So that's why I wanted to invite Ashley here today. So I just quickly want to introduce her and tell you a little bit about her. Ashley Anderson operates a micro bakery out of her home in Tacoma, Washington. So she's a Tacoma girl just like me. She specializes in sourdough breads and pastries. She started out baking bread out of a desire to find a bread that was made from local grains grown organically, that was nutrient dense and flavorful and naturally leavened. She started sharing it with friends and then getting requests, and a little bread bakery was born. She previously has sold her bread through a weekly subscription or share program, as well as our local Proctor Farmers Market, which I was just there this past weekend. It's an awesome market. And she now has a 7-month-old, and she's getting back into baking bread regularly. So excited to have Ashley here in the building. Gonna add her in here. Welcome, Ashley. I am super excited. As I was mentioning, you've probably heard this a lot. Everyone's baking bread this year. Everyone's trying to become a sourdough baker. So I'm sure you've had lots of questions and requests that come your way. So thank you so much for coming and joining us to talk about bread.
Of course.
So just in terms of where you started and got started out with baking, what was it that initially drew you to baking bread?
I actually took a trip to France, and I really wasn't a huge bread person before that. I baked a lot, but mostly just kind of sweets, cakes kind of thing. And I grew up baking, and we went to one of the oldest sourdough bakeries in France, and I still can remember the taste of the bread as we were riding the train. And I'd never had bread like that before. And I just thought, okay, well, this is it. I have to figure out how to make this. And then I started kind of figuring out a little bit of history about bread. And I couldn't find that taste of bread again. And so that's how I started making it for myself. And then just started making way too much and just started giving it away.
That's so awesome. So it was travel that brought you into the world of bread, which is so perfect because my group is Travel and Feast, and that's exactly what you did. You were traveling and feasting on bread, and that brought you to baking bread for your friends and family here in the States. That's so awesome. Yeah. And so I have a ton of questions from people on specific things they wanted to do. So I'm just going to dive right into some of the questions that people have been sharing. So the first one, I think this question was from Claudia. She asked, how do you create the mother? Is it called the mother for the sourdough?
Yeah, so there's lots of names for it. So a sourdough culture, wild yeast culture, a mother, a chef. It has lots of different names kind of based on the culture that it's in. And a mother is kind of just a general term also for something that starts a fermentation. So similar as kombucha, they have like a mother that they put in the jar. So yes, definitely called a mother. And I think it's very fitting because it is the thing that makes all of the little bread babies. You know, it's always the original one, and then it continues to make multiples. And so I think it's a very fitting name.
So how do you create that?
So it takes anywhere from about, I would say the fastest that you'll probably see any fermentation activity is about 4 days. It usually takes about a week up to 2 weeks to actually get it to the point where it will make a really good loaf of bread. And so that is the fermentation. It'll start just spontaneously. So all you need is water and flour. There's a lot of recipes out there that say that you can add fruit water or any type of yeast, but like champagne yeast, but you really don't need anything except really good flour and some water. And so the fermentation happens spontaneously because of the wild yeast on the grain. So the freshest flour you'll have means you'll get a quicker starter. So the older flour you have, the harder it will get to create a starter because there's less nutrients and active yeast on the grain. And so there's yeast everywhere in the air and the water on our bodies. And so that's where it catches it from. And then after about 4 days, it'll start to ferment. So you'll mix flour and water together, and there's a ratio that you do. It's equal parts. So it's called a baker's percentage. So you base that off the flour. So if you have 100 grams of flour, you'll also add 100 grams of water. So it's a 1-to-1 ratio. And then you let that sit for 24 hours, and then you scoop half of it out and you feed it. So it just means adding more water and flour, but keeping that half of the original amount, because that what has like the goodness that's happening that hasn't quite shown itself yet. And so then you'll do that every day, once a day, and then you'll just keep it in a warm spot with not an airtight lid on it. It needs a little bit of airflow. Mm-hmm. And then, eventually you'll just glance at it and it will have started to grow. And it's like one of the coolest things I've ever done. It's like a little science experiment.
Yeah, I think this is like a thing to do with kids, because I'm sure that they would be fascinated by what's happening in there.
Yeah, totally.
And Julie, I see your question here, so want to also answer this one. Julie asks, how do you get a great open crumb?
Okay, so there's a few factors for that. One is having a really active starter that you start with. And so I've kind of found that no matter how many fermentation process or steps you do in the process, it always kind of comes back to the starter and how active it is. And so what I mean by that is the rise and fall. So what you'll feed your starter, and that's kind of like people call it a refresh. So you'll keep the original amount of the starter, add new fresh water and fresh flour, and then you'll watch it grow. And so as you watch it grow, then it will have eaten all of the available sugar. And that's kind of the yeast and the bacteria doing that. And then it'll get essentially hungry again, and it'll start to drop back down. So as it eats it, it creates gas. And so that's what raises it, making little air bubbles. Mm-hmm. And then as it gets hungry, all the air falls out and the CO2 leaves and then drops back down. And so if you can watch that rise and fall pattern of your sourdough starter, it should be roughly about 4 hours. And so if it's in a warm-ish climate. So it likes, like I call like beach weather. It's like 76, 77 degrees is like perfect. That's what it likes. If it's any colder, it'll just take a little bit longer. So making sure that you have an active starter and you use it right at its peak, so right before it starts to fall back down. And then you can make bread straight from a starter, or you can do the second step, which is called a levain. And so essentially you will just make another mixture with your starter, but making sure that that starter is active no matter what steps that you do after that. And then the second thing that really helps with having an open crumb is whenever you are folding the bread, you're not pressing on the bread. So with like a classic yeast bread, you need the dough really hard and tight at the beginning because commercial yeast makes the bread rise super fast. So you want to think the gluten structures are making a web. And so with sourdough, it's so much more relaxed, and you're very gently folding the bread throughout the fermentation bulk, that if you were to press on the bread too hard, then it knocks all the air out. Mm-hmm. And with commercial yeast, you want to do that because it blows up like a balloon. And so you want to create that really tight structure at the beginning, and you want to press it so that as it opens up into that really big balloon, it doesn't pop. But with sourdough, it's kind of the opposite. It's kind of less is more. So you want to be really gentle as you fold it, and that allows as much air to stay in the bread as possible. And that's what the open crumb is all that air.
That makes so much sense. As you're talking, it kind of reminds me of like working with like egg whites when you're trying to use a meringue and you have all this air that's in there. You have to be so gentle because you want to leave that air in there for like macaroni or something like that. So
yeah, like when you fold the egg whites into a batter or something, you really want to be really gentle, and that's kind of the idea.
Awesome. And you mentioned about old and new flour. How do I know that I have old flour or newer flour that's going to be able to create more active uh, starter?
Yeah. So what I generally will advise is getting, if you can, stone milled flour, which it can be a little bit difficult to find because there's not a lot of people doing it. But if you get a roller milled flour, which it's not necessarily bad, you want to buy organic flour. And if it is roller milled, that process, it heats the grain. And so if you think grain is an alive ingredient, kind of like vegetables or fruit, anything, you want to make sure that it's as fresh as possible. Mm-hmm. So through the roller milling process, it heats it and it kills all of the yeast that's on the flour essentially, and that's what makes it shelf stable for longer periods of time. So if you were to look at an expiration date on a bag of flour and it's a year from now, well, it's already taken probably 6 months to get that flour onto the shelf. And then a year later, there's going to really be no alive yeast on it anymore. And so if you can buy stone milled flour, then what that's doing is it's not heating the grain. It is grinding it in an old way, keeping the integrity of the grain and everything alive so that in a normal environment, in like a cool basement or in just a grocery store, it'll stay fresh because it's not warm. So it is an alive food. You just want to keep it in that temperature range so that when you use it, you're getting all of that available yeast that's on the grain. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that totally makes sense. That and that when things have to be shelf stable, that you're going to be basically having to kill all of the things that are active, and that's what you want is the active yeast to make the starter really really active. So that totally makes sense. And in terms of sourcing that, do you just look for like local farms or like a farmer's market? Where would you?
Yeah, I buy all my grain from a miller called Cairn Spring Mills, and they mill their flour up in Burlington, and it's all local farmers who are either sustainably growing their grain or organically growing their grain. And so it's older styles of grain which are more nutritious, and then they're also stone milled. And then I believe that they do sell their flour at Metropolitan Market. And I know that they do sell it through their own mill. There's also one in Oregon called Camas Country. And then there's a few other smaller ones. Fairhaven Grain is in, I want to say maybe like Vashon, one of the islands. So they're similarly close. And you can also buy it online. And so if you were to just Google stone milled grain, you'll be able to find it. It's just not as readily available as, say, like King Arthur flour.
Yeah, so you're probably not gonna be able to run to your grocery store and find this on every shelf or like a big chain grocery store. Maybe something specialty grocer, a more like sustainable and those kinds of things, like you're saying, like maybe Metropolitan Market, a little higher end grocer. So if you guys are looking for stone milled flour instead of some of the, what did you say was pressed?
It's roller milled.
Roller milled. Okay.
Yeah.
So the next question I have, this one is from Mateusz. He asked, how do you know how the starter is supposed to taste and smell? I had no idea what I'm going for and didn't know if it's done good or not. His wife, Lauren, kept saying it's bad.
So they can get pretty stinky. That's totally normal. It's totally fine. The only two things that I'll say that your starter has gone bad is if it has black or white spots on it. So that means that there's mold growth, and that means that the integrity of the starter has been compromised. You need to start over. Other than that, it's totally fine. So it can smell really sour like vinegar. It can also smell really sweet like yogurt. So it should always smell fermenty. But any plethora of tastes and smells, I've smelled some that smell like stinky, like cheese. totally fine. I kind of think that everybody's starter is going to smell different, because if you think about what it's doing is it's pulling any wild yeast from your body, your home, your environment, and so it's going to smell like what you've got around you.
Yeah,
It's not
yeah.
going to smell bad, but it's going to smell different. I've had starters that I've given people, and it smells like mine, and then in about 2 weeks, it starts to smell different. And
Oh,
so it's just a different bacteria, different yeast environment. And so that's what's kind of cool is everybody's bread is going to taste a little bit different. And
mhm.
I almost think that's like an evolution thing, because you are making food that you enjoy. And so you're going to want to make bread that you like to eat. And so in your own environment that you like, your bread is going to start to taste like something that you enjoy the most.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it can also, if you taste it, it'll taste a little tangy. It won't taste like gross. It just tastes a little fermenty, kind of sour.
Yeah,
Um,
it's sourdough.
yeah,
And I love that
yeah,
because it's like your bread is a very personal thing that it's going to turn out different based on you, and so I love that it's unique to each person. Um,
yeah. And also based on the flour that you feed it, it will either um, start to make certain types of strains of bacteria. So some are what they call I forget the exact term of it, but essentially it tastes sweeter or more mild, like yogurt. So, like a lactobacillus bacteria is very kind of yogurty. It's very light. And then some other strains will have more of that vinegar smell. So, a whole wheat, if you're feeding your starter with a whole wheat flour, it will ferment faster because there's more available sugar.
mhm.
And it will have more of that vinegar smell. If you're feeding it with something like a bread flour, it has less of the bran, so it has less sugar in it. And so it will smell sweeter, and it will take a little bit, it'll have a little bit of a different pattern of fermentation. It won't be as quick, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. That
Mm-hmm.
was perfect. Okay, so the next question is, how do you know how long to proof the dough? The few times that I've tried to make bread, that's where I err.
Okay. Um, so depending on what style you're doing, there's a couple types of the proofing. So proofing after you've already shaped it, or proofing during the bulk, does it say?
She did not say. No, I was just
Okay.
going down to see if I could find who the question was so I could call them out in case they were on here.
No, I can answer both. It's
Oh, that
good.
was from Jen Floto. So Jen, I don't know if you're on yet, but if you are, you can answer the question. But yeah, she didn't say which one.
Okay, so with the first, generally like the guideline that I'll do is I'll take a starter and I'll make the levain, and so that's just a smaller mixture of starter water and flour, and I'll let that ferment. So that's what leavens the bread. So that's what you add to it to make the bread. So once you start to do what is called the bulk fermentation, after you've added the starter and the salt and you've given it a good mix, then that section before you shape the bread is called the bulk fermentation. Depending on if you have all ideal conditions, so the dough temperature is roughly like 77, 78 degrees, or just your home is that environment, you can kind of guess that it's going to be, that temperature. It takes the ambient temperature of wherever it is pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Roughly about 4 hours. So in the summer, it can take as little as 3.5. I wouldn't go any less than that, because then um, you're not getting a full bulk fermentation, and that can also contribute to a really dense crumb, or like, not an open crumb.
Mm.
So I would say a general rule is about 4 hours. If your temperature is less than 75, it's going to take at least 6 hours. Just that few drop of temperature in degrees, just one or two, can really slow it down, which is totally fine. Um, You just have to kind of let it do its thing. What you're looking for is for it to at least double in its size. It should have a good amount of bubbles. And if you were to pull at the dough, it should stretch. And if you know what the window pane test is, by the time it's done bulk fermenting, and if you've given it enough turns, enough folds, it will have past that window pane stretch. If you pick up a piece of dough and you stretch it apart, you should be able to see through it without it tearing.
Yes, I've seen people do that on TV.
Yeah, and that means it's strong, and it should be really jiggly and kind of really look like it's full of life. So at that point, roughly around 4 hours, and then the second proof, you can do it as an ambient proof. So that just means room temperature, or you can do a retarded proof, which is in the refrigerator, and you do that for an extended period of time. So the ambient proof would be, it's a little trickier just because it has a shorter window. So you really have to pay attention to it. So you have roughly about 2 hours for it to proof like on your counter in a warmish environment. And again, it should have risen by at least 20% and be really jiggly. And if you press it, stick your finger into the dough, it should bounce back halfway. If it stays sunken, it means that it's past the prime fermentation point. It's totally still edible. Definitely still bake it and eat it, but it might just not have the rise you're looking for. And if you press it with your finger and it springs back all the way right away, it means it needs a little bit more time.
Got it.
In the refrigerator, though, as long as your refrigerator stays roughly below 42 degrees, you can leave it in there, I would say minimum 8 hours or up to 24 hours. And so that gives you a greater window for way less error, and it's way easier to score. Because as it gets cold in the fridge, those CO2 air bubbles in the dough, they start to compress. They don't go away. So it won't necessarily rise a lot in the refrigerator. It will rise to a certain point and then almost start to kind of sink back down on itself, but it shouldn't look sunken. It just doesn't necessarily look really jiggly because it's cold. But once you put it in the oven, all that air will expand and you'll still get a really beautiful loaf. So just a little bit of a different feel for it.
Yeah, well, that sounds like a nice like kind of safety net to put it in the refrigerator.
Totally.
I like those kinds of tricks. Put it in the refrigerator.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next question that we have, this one is from Stephanie, and she asked about hydration levels. How do you calculate how much water to use based on different flours? For instance, whole wheat, rye, bread flour, all-purpose used in the dough.
Okay, so with that, to really calculate how much you're doing based on a recipe, if you're following one, is to take the however much flour you're using, and that's going to be what we call like a baker's percentage. So let's say you have 1,000 grams of flour that you're using in your recipe. If you have 700 grams of water, that's 70%. So that's a 70% hydration level, which is a really good hydration level to have in a sourdough if you are new to it. The higher hydration you go, the stickier it gets, the harder to handle if you're unfamiliar with it. And then if you do go too high, it will start to break down because the flour won't be able to absorb all the water that you're giving it. And so a very average number is 75% hydration level, and that should really give you a good loaf with all-purpose bread flour, even whole wheat. It will be a little bit denser just because whole wheat does absorb a lot more moisture. And then when you're working with flours that I work with, based on when it was grown, what the temperature or what the hydration level of the grain was. So it has moisture before they dry it and mill it. And so at whatever moisture it is before they mill it could be different, whether it's grown in the spring or the winter. And each one can be a little different. So I always tell people, give yourself at least a 5%, omit about 5% water when you start. Test the dough, see if you like how how hydrated it is, and it shouldn't be really sloppy. So it should be a little tacky, and it shouldn't be dry, not with just a regular artisan loaf. If you're gonna do like a whole wheat loaf, you can go all the way up to, I mean, at least 90%, and that'll give you a really good whole wheat dough. It is harder to handle though, the higher you get, but I wouldn't go any lower than about 70%. And then just know that you can always add more water throughout the bulk if you still think that it needs more, but you can't take it away.
Yeah. Always important thing to know. I did a little piece on making pie crust, and similarly we were talking like with the water, you can put more in if you need it, but you can't take it out. So if you want to flake pie crust, don't just dump all that water inside your crust. So
yeah, totally.
I think it's a common theme for working with flour and water. Put less in and then add it if you need it.
Yeah, and it is tempting, I feel like, to keep adding it, and then once it starts to absorb the water, sometimes it does get a little overhydrated.
That makes sense. Perfect. Well, thank you, Stephanie, for that question. That was like an advanced question. I think Stephanie has been making quite a bit of sourdough. Okay, so the next one is on New York Bagels. This was from Lisa. She mentioned, she said she just wrote New York Bagels. So I was like, do you want to know how to make New York Bagels? And Ashley mentioned that she makes a lot of bagels at home. So what guidance do you have for somebody who's trying to make New York style bagels at home?
Yeah, so with bagels, it's a little different than just like a traditional artisan recipe. So it's a lot less hydration. So probably roughly about 50%. Then I add barley malt. So you can buy barley malt syrup, and that's what I use. Some recipes will call for the powder, but I found the barley malt syrup at some point, and I really like it. I add it to the actual dough, probably maybe 5%. So you don't want a ton of sugar in it, but a little bit of sugar in the dough helps it have that chewiness. And then when you boil the bagel, which is traditional New York style, you boil them and then you bake them, put barley malt in the water. So that barley malt in the water will add a little coating to the outside of the bagel, and so 30 seconds on each side of the bagel, take them out, and then it will help to caramelize the outside of the bagel when you bake them, and that's what gives you that really really nice crust on a bagel and a nice chewiness to the inside. And with bagels, you really knead them a lot, and so you want a really smooth dough, and I always will make the bulk of it. I'll knead it really, really, really well for about 10 minutes. There's a lot of kneading styles on YouTube of videos how people knead their bagels. It's really just like a fascinating thing to watch in general. But yeah, about 10 minutes. Sometimes I'll let it rest if the dough starts to tear. Just like rest it on the counter for about 10 minutes and then come back to it and continue to knead it until it gets really smooth and elastic. And then I'll let that sit for probably about 4 hours. I don't even touch it. I just leave it alone. And then I'll take it out and shape them. And then I ferment them in the fridge overnight. And then I will bake them in the morning.
That sounds perfect. Now I want to go make bagels. I've never tried making bagels before.
That's fun.
Okay, and the other question, which is a non-sourdough question, was on making challah bread. Do you have? I know this is actually, I guess, the season for a lot of people for making challah bread at home. So, any guidance you have for people on making challah bread?
Yeah, so very similar thing to making bagels is that it's a low hydration dough, but with challah bread, it's what you call an enriched bread. So there's no milk and there's no butter, but there is a good amount of eggs in it. And so what eggs do is they put a lot of weight into the dough. And so it takes so much longer for the bread to rise efficiently because it's so heavy. So really be patient with it rising, whether or not you're using yeast or sourdough. The sourdough will just take longer than a yeasted bread. I've seen people do a combination where they'll add a little bit of yeast and also have the sourdough, so you have the fermentation and you have a more predictable, fast rise time, which is totally fine. And it makes that really nice lacy crumb. But yeah, because of the eggs, you really do want to give it just a little bit more time than you think to have that rise. Otherwise, it will be more dense. And then you want to give it its second rise. So after you've kneaded it really well, try the window pane test. Give it its rise. So I would say generally the ones I've only made with sourdough. It takes about 6 hours for the bulk rise. Then after you roll out the strands, I don't know if you're braiding them, twisting them, whatever you choose to do, have it in a somewhat warm environment. And then I proof it directly on whatever I'm going to bake it on. That way I don't have to move it. Because as you start to move it, any type of movement, pressure on that kind of really delicate dough will deflate the dough. And so give it a couple hour rise at a warm room temperature. And then I always brush it with like an egg wash. Yeah.
Yeah, that's perfect. Well, I have just a couple more questions for her, but if anybody that, as you guys are popping in, if you have a last minute question for Ashley, feel free to toss those in. I'll try to get to them before we wrap up. I just have like a couple more for you. So one of the things you mentioned was the benefits of eating sourdough, and that's one of the things you like to share with people. So I wanted to just kind of dive into that a little bit more because a lot of people, I think of bread and they're like, I don't know if I should be eating that much bread. So what are some of the benefits of eating sourdough?
Yeah, so that's kind of like one of the reasons why I did start making my own bread. I had a lot of I'd say like friends who had stopped, kind of, abandoned bread. And,
the gluten-free movement, everyone's like, don't eat bread.
Yeah. And I feel like it's just like another fad in a way. You can be allergic to wheat. That's totally possible. It still is only about 1% of the population, which is very similar to other allergens like any allergen to a fruit or a vegetable. So it's pretty low, but the sensitivity to wheat is solely, in my opinion, due to two factors. The commercialization of wheat. What they did in America, at least, is they modified the grain to be thicker on the outside. So there's 3 parts to a grain molecule. There's the bran, which is the outer side, which is the difficult part to digest for people who are sensitive to it. And then the inside, which is the endosperm and the germ. And so that's where all the nutrient, a lot of the fat, the protein is on the inside, and a lot of the B vitamins and micronutrients are on the outside in the bran. And so what it also has on it is phytic acid. And so we can't digest phytic acid. We don't have the enzyme in our body to do that. So as the outer side of the grain got thicker, it got harder to digest. Well, when they're milling all of that.
Was that just to like make it hardier so that it would like be easier in the environment, or?
Yeah, totally. Okay. So as they have these huge crops, it basically gave them the ability to mill it without it having any disease, or because smaller grain is also harder. It takes a longer process to mill because you have to get all the small grains off the stem, whereas the bigger ones are a lot easier. They were more less disease prone because the outer side was thicker, so it was essentially had more ability to protect the grain itself, which is essentially what it's for, is to protect itself. And not let anything in the environment in. And so that way, you didn't have to have big yields of grain that they couldn't use that year. So essentially, it was just to help get larger yields and be essentially more profitable in growing grain. But with that is kind of the flip side, is that it didn't actually work in our health benefit. Mm-hmm. And so when they take all that grain, and most, I say like any packaged food has that commercial grain in it. And so they mill the entire grain. They don't take the bran out. And so when you're eating, and the whole grains movement that happened a while back, that essentially kind of did the opposite effect because they weren't souring the grain. And so the souring process, like a sourdough or soaking it in something else like kefir or apple cider vinegar, anything that will soak or sour the grain, which helps neutralize that acid. And so if you can neutralize the phytic acid in the grain, then we can access all of the nutrients that are in grain. So there's pretty much a complete protein in grain. There's also phosphorus, magnesium, selenium, a bunch of stuff that we do really benefit from eating, but we can't access it unless we sour it or soak it. And so that's very similar to a lot of nuts or other seeds, or even like non-glutinous grains like millet, quinoa, things like that. And so if you can if you have the ability to sour or soak it, then when you eat it, your body can absorb all those nutrients. And so if you kind of think of the body as pulling in a lot of food to process, anything that is an environmental toxin, it tends to either get crowded in the body or your body digests it and then sends it out as like, it has the ability to process it. If we eat a lot of food that has a harder time moving through us, our body can't access the nutrients, then you think you're getting good, healthy food, but your body's not actually getting the nutrients. It's just moving through the body.
Yeah.
And so that essentially creates sensitivities in the body because it's taxing the body every time you eat it. It can't pull in the nutrients. It's just trying to process it and get rid of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the other thing is glyphosates. So that's essentially Roundup. And so that's sprayed on so much stuff. It's a weed killer. It's like what everybody uses. And a lot of that they would spray on the wheat at the very end so that it would dry faster. And so essentially, yeah, so you're ingesting that. And so however much or minimum you are ingesting over time, if you're ingesting a lot of it, your body just gets taxed. And so if your body gets taxed, then it starts to have sensitivities to things. So anytime you'd eat it, it would say, oh, I don't like that. I can't process that. And you'd have a reaction to it. And so that's essentially what's happening. So it's not necessarily that bread is bad for you. It's just that the way that it's being processed right now isn't necessarily helpful for our bodies to feel good when we eat it.
Right. Yeah, I noticed when I would go to like Europe, as you were mentioning before, and eat bread in Europe, my body would react completely different to it. And I was like, what's different about the bread? And then I started learning some of these things that you've been sharing on like how the crops are taken care of and it's different in different parts of the world. And so your body can react completely differently. And you were mentioning souring. And so that may have been something they were doing that isn't happening at the bread I eat at home. So totally makes sense that that whole process of how the crop is treated and how the flour is prepared will make a big difference in how your body reacts to it.
Yeah, totally. And a lot of grain that they grow, and what a lot of farmers are choosing to do now over here is growing different varieties of wheat. And so the variety of wheat that's grown in commercially here is only one type of wheat. And so if you're eating just the same one over and over, that might create a sensitivity. Mm-hmm. But if you had different types, the ability to have other grains that are being sustainably grown. So they have different flavor profiles, different, little bit different qualities. And so you're not just getting the same thing every time. And the wheat, because it is its original form, it's its original seed, it's a little bit harder to grow. It's more finicky. You have to pay attention to it more. But in the end, you do get a better product, something that is a little bit easier to digest.
Awesome. And actually, kind of on the topic of flours, Julie said a follow-up question. She asked, do you need to use the same type of flour each time you feed your starter?
No, you don't have to. But if you are switching flours, then you'll just need to know that it will change the energy of the flour, so or of the starter. So with an all-purpose flour, it won't necessarily have a really open, bubbly fermentation because the gluten is weaker in AP flour than it is in bread flour. If you're feeding it with bread flour, it's going to have really big open air bubbles as you feed it because the gluten is stronger. If you're using a whole wheat flour, it will also be a little bit less airy because it's heavy due to all the bran that's in it. If you feed it with a rye starter, same thing. Rye has a very gummy quality to it that wheat doesn't really have. Um, yeah, so don't be alarmed if it suddenly changes its activity. It's totally fine. It's just that the flour has different yeast on it and it's just reacting different to it.
Perfect. Julie, thank you for all of your questions. And thank you, Ashley, for your amazing answers. The last thing I wanted to talk was you mentioned like that sourdough, we've talked about this a little, it's very personal. And you also mentioned that it should fit into your schedule. And so I just wanted to quickly touch on that because I think something for me and probably for others is that bread can seem intimidating to tackle. And I'm like, leave that to the bakers, leave that to the professionals. So as somebody who might be starting out or who is a novice around bread, like what do you mean when you say like it should fit into your schedule, and what should people kind of keep in mind around starting to bake bread for the first time?
Yeah, so essentially when I first started making bread, I made kind of yeasted bread, and that was really I would say really intimidating for me because you really had to be on it. Things moved really fast, and whenever I found sourdough, I felt like, oh, this is like a really chill way to make bread. You can kind of just let it do its thing. All you're really there for is to make sure that it has like a good structure. All of the bacteria and the yeast, they're doing all of it. You're just kind of there as a guide to get it into like a somewhat of a shape and bake it. That's like, and eat it. That's like what you're there for. And so when you're trying to get it to fit into your schedule, this really kind of came about. When I first started, I followed all the recipes and all the books like to a T, and I would carry my bread around with me when I went to work, and I did all this, and I was like, okay, this isn't sustainable. Not everybody can do this, and so like, how do I make it easier?
That's so cute. It's like I'm just going more like a baby. A real baby, so obviously you don't have time for that.
Yeah, totally. And so going through like making bread for the farmer's market, I had a lot of different cycles of bread going. So like things that were going through the ambient temperature proofing, things that were going through the retarded temperature proofing. And what I just really realized is sourdough is really resilient. And as long as you know what you're looking for, you can watch the dough and make it however you want to. So let's say you want to make fresh bread in the morning and you only have time in the evening to make bread. That's totally fine. You could mix up the dough, let it have a couple hour proof at room temperature, stick it in the fridge overnight and just let it do its bulk at night. Then you could take it out in the morning, give it a shape, let it rise for an hour and then bake it. And so by just allowing yourself that trial and error, maybe get a notebook and write down what you did and see how you like to do it. That's kind of figuring out how it works with your schedule. So it's really, when do I have time to do it? When does it fit in my schedule? And how can I shorten this bulk or lengthen this bulk so that I can get a loaf and bake it when it works for me? And then when I was about to have my baby, I had a couple of friends who really wanted to learn how to make bread because they had been eating my bread for years and suddenly they might not have it. And so it was really cool for me to watch them. I gave them my recipe and they essentially made it into their own lives. So they make it their own way. They've experimented with different lengths of bulk, how to do it at certain temperatures. And it's been really inspiring for me because every loaf of bread they bake looks totally awesome. And it's just if you know what you're looking for and you follow the general guideline of watching the dough rise, making sure that it has a sufficient rise, it really can kind of work for you. And for some people that might be like really anxiety inducing because we really like to follow that exact recipe, and sourdough is really not like that. I've read a bunch of books that people have put out from their own bakeries that they have their own sourdough, and all of the recipes are slightly different. And that's just another kind of telltale sign to me that they tweaked it so that it worked for them, and they're making great bread. And it's totally fine to mess up a lot. It's still eatable,
Put some butter on it. It'll taste good.
It's totally fine.
That's for you, Lauren. Lauren is always saying, just put butter on everything. Oh, amazing. Well, thank you so much, Ashley. This has been such a treat having you here, and you've shared so many amazing things. I can't wait now. I want to go try breaking my own bread. So if people want to find you, they want more, where can they get more from you and the Brown Paper Baking Company?
Yeah, my website is brownpaperbaking.com. I recently have updated my website, so I'm working on getting just some of my old recipes that were on my blog up on there. How to make a sourdough starter, little tips and stuff. You can also, if you are making sourdough, and you have questions or you want to send me a picture of it, if you just want to know, definitely do that. I get a lot of emails and pictures of bread, and it is really, it's cool for me because I get to see it, and it's like one of my favorite things. So really don't hesitate if you have some questions. Yeah, it's a journey, and it's like a relationship. And so the longer you work at it, the better it gets.
Well, thank you for offering that to everyone here.
Yeah.
So for those of you here, that's an amazing invitation to get guidance directly from Ashley. She'll be able to give you some feedback on your sourdough. So you can find her at her website, the brownpaperbaking.com. And then you're also on Instagram. They can find you.
My Instagram is brownpaperbreads.
Brown Paper Bread. So at Brown Paper Breads, if you want to find Ashley on Instagram. Thank you again. This has been.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for answering all of these questions. And if you guys want to follow up with her, you know where to find her. I think that's it for today. Thank you for Bread Week. You'll see lots more. We'll be continuing to talk about bread for the rest of this week. If you guys want to see additional experts like Ashley here in the group to come share more about the specialties that they have, please let me know who you'd love to see. So we've done bread, we've had wine. What else do you guys want to see? Let me know, and I'll make sure to continue inviting amazing people like Ashley to come here and offer additional guidance on areas around cooking and foods from around the world. So thank you guys. Thanks, Ashley. Have a wonderful afternoon.
You
Bye,
too.
everyone.
Bye.